You might have heard that androgen receptors downregulate, and you need to switch compounds every 6 to 8 weeks to clean out your receptors and keep gains coming. And you might have heard that you need to come off cycle for the same time you're on cycle to restore androgen receptor sensitivity. Wrong. Let me explain right after this wall of relinquished responsibilities. Vigorous Steve here. So depending on which study you read, the androgen receptor might have a half-life anywhere between 3.1 hours to over 30 hours. And it highly depends on which tissue this androgen receptor is investigated in, and if it's unbound or bound to testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, or another derivative, anabolic androgenic steroids included. Unbound androgen receptors have a half-life of about 3.1 to 3.3 hours, again depending on the cell that's determined in. And it appears that bound androgen receptors have a mean half-life anywhere between 6.6 to 7 hours, but in some tissues, in some circumstances, that might be extended to over 30 hours. Androgens prevent androgen receptor degradation, which greatly extends the half-life compared to unbound androgen receptors. Androgen-bound androgen receptors form dimers and use zinc fingers to attach to specific sequences of the DNA, where it starts transcribing genes into messenger RNA, which then in turn is translated by ribosomes to form specific proteins, resulting in all kinds of anabolic effects downstream. So that basically means that you need 2 androgen receptors for androgen-mediated gene transcription, and part of this process is to produce more androgen receptors, because otherwise you would deplete all of your androgen receptors by taking androgens. We know the half-life of unbound androgen receptors is about 3 hours, and bound androgen receptors is about 7 hours. So the turnover of androgen receptors happens multiple times per day. So now we already know that androgen receptor downregulation and loss of sensitivity is kind of horseshit. Basic human biology aside, let's start debunking with the great example of terrible regurgitation amongst the studies, anti-steroid propaganda studies, I might add. This study performed by Ding et al. December 10th, 2021, titled Anabolic Androgenic Steroid Misuse, Mechanisms, Patterns of Misuse, User Typology, and Adverse Effects. Scrolling down, and I quote, "Other studies have shown that anabolic androgenic steroid administration can result in androgen receptor downregulation, since androgens can also competitively bind to estrogen receptors." Really? If the androgen receptors are downregulated, they can interact with estrogen receptors and through that exert an anti-estrogenic effect. Well, I'm not entirely sure about that, but let's follow the citation nonetheless to a study performed by Albano et al. From January 19th, 2021, so that's a little bit earlier than the previous study, titled Adverse Effects of Anabolic Androgenic Steroids, a Literature Review. Another propaganda title. Scrolling down, and I quote, "Moreover, testosterone is converted by aromatase action to estradiol and esterone, mostly estradiol, and then another enzyme contributes to estrone synthesis, influencing brain and sexual differentiation, bone and muscle mass increase, puberty and sexual functions. High doses of anabolic androgenic steroids exert an anti-estrogenic effect due to a downregulation of androgen receptors and a competition with estrogens with their receptors." It's not entirely true, right? DHT derivatives, boldenone, some of their metabolites might prevent the conversion of testosterone into estradiol and thus keep testosterone levels high and reduce serum estradiol levels, obviously, duh. But it has nothing to do with their receptor sites. And well, the established relative binding affinity for commonly used anabolic steroids for the estrogen alpha and beta receptors is less than 0.1 compared to estradiol. So what the are you talking about? And yes, I'm well aware that oxymetholone might have some potential estrogen receptor modulating effect, but I can't find any clear scientific evidence that that's actually the case. William Lebelin mentioned this in his anabolics books, but then you go to PubMed, Science Direct, ResearchGate, or another publication website, and you can't find any interaction between the oxymetholone molecule and the estrogen alpha and beta receptor. So just because oxymetholone might give you puffy nipples doesn't mean that it's going to potentiate gynecomastia through the estrogen alpha and beta receptors, right? Scientific evidence, and then we start talking. But hey, feel free to cite me a study in the comment section down below. I quote studies all the time. I did my part. Now it's your job. Okay, so let's follow the citation to a study that's actually interesting to read, that isn't steroid propaganda, has been performed very well, and is a study that actually everybody in the enhanced fitness community can learn from. Study performed by Arazid et al. Titled Use of Anabolic Androgenic Steroid Produces Greater Oxidative Stress Responses to Resistance Training in Strength-Trained Men. Long story short, training increases oxidative stress, and training on steroid increases oxidative stress even more. Right? This is one of the reasons why I decided to come off cycle, because oxidative stress is terrible for your fertility parameters. And now that I'm training less intense because the anabolic steroids are out of the picture, guess what? My fertility parameters A-okay. And then after you read the entire study, you'll see that there's no mention of androgen receptors, whether that's downregulation or loss of sensitivity, aromatase enzymes, or anti-estrogenic effects of anabolic androgenic steroids. So I really don't know where these previous two studies get their quotation from. It's not anywhere in this study. It's about oxidative stress being enhanced in the context of using anabolic androgenic steroids when you're training insane. Now you know I have trust issues with scientific literature, right? I mean, I don't know how much prednisone these researchers were on of the first two studies, but it sounds like propaganda to me, and following the citations results in nothing. Absolutely zero concrete scientific evidence that androgen receptors are downregulated and that there's some sort of weird overlap with the estrogen receptors. So what can we do to make sure that the androgen receptors are working continuously? And instead of diving into a lot of individual studies showing that androgens do upregulate the androgen receptor, let's have a look at this excellent review paper performed by Santos et al., published on August 3rd, 2022, titled Downregulation of Androgen Receptors upon Anabolic Androgenic Steroids, a Cause or a Flawed Hypothesis of the Muscle Building Plateau. This study looked at all the supposed literature of androgen receptor downregulation in the presence of exogenously administered steroids, and they found a single rodent study where the androgen receptor was downregulated after serum testosterone levels increased following finasteride administration. So that's not even exogenous testosterone, that's endogenous testosterone levels coming up by preventing conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone with a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. And finasteride is known to interfere with the androgen receptor, and dihydrotestosterone is known to upregulate the androgen receptors. So you have a blocking effect and a downregulating effect, and it's not even from exogenous steroids, it's from finasteride. All the more reasons not to use finasteride. Besides reducing dihydrotestosterone levels, it might also make your elevated testosterone work less. Further research proved that testosterone and oxandrolone upregulates androgen receptors in vitro cultured human and porcine skeletal muscle cells, as well as biopsied skeletal muscle cells from trained humans as well, but more on that later. And the researchers also note that androgen receptor downregulation is merely an anecdotal report of the steroid users/abusers, and these supposed effects aren't really observed in the real world or scientific scenarios. So basically, androgen receptor downregulation is complete Broscience, which is still science nonetheless, right? An N of 1 anecdotal experience, but I can't find anything in the scientific literature to support this idea. Now, to drive the nail even further into the coffin, let's start spamming a couple studies while we're at it. These androgen receptor upregulating effects of testosterone and dihydrotestosterone are further confirmed in this study, or at least in an in vitro study using cultured human muscle satellite cells. In this study, the androgen receptor upregulating effects are also confirmed, which is an in vitro study using porcine myogenic satellite cells. And then again, in this study, where they used 200 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week, shown to increase androgen receptor content of skeletal muscle of physically active, non-obese men following a 55% caloric restrictive diet. So this is confirmation in real-life human subjects using biopsies to determine if androgen receptor content of skeletal muscle has changed following steroid administration. And we have another one. Same case for oxandrolone, right? There were 6 healthy men with an average age of 22 years old, a little bit too young, if I might add. They received 15 milligrams oral oxandrolone when that was still FDA approved in the United States for 5 days, after which androgen receptor messenger RNA significantly increased within skeletal muscle, also proven with biopsies. So now we have 4 studies proving that androgen receptors upregulate in the presence of testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, and oxandrolone, and 1 study proving that androgen receptors downregulate due to finasteride treatment. So why would you even want to take that? Keep your DHT levels nice and high. And if you're worried about hair loss, well, use some sort of androgen receptor blocker on the scalp. Not do anything systemic, because you might get a systemic negative net outcome regarding anabolism and libido for that matter, so don't even try. Now, that being said, there's more to androgen response than just androgen receptor binding or upregulation. First of all, androgen receptors have GAG repeats, which determine how tightly or how loosely androgens bind when these androgen receptors form dimers. GAG stands for cytosine, adenine, and guanine, and generally speaking, fewer GAG repeats result in more tightly bound androgens to the androgen receptor, which increases gene transcription and ultimately all the beneficial anabolic processes downstream. A normal range is typically around 9 to 35 GAG repeats, but on average, most humans have between 18 to 24 GAG repeats. So you have to be a genetic outlier for you to have less GAG repeats for very tight androgen receptor binding to androgens, and thus a lot of gene transcription, making you a little bit more freaky than everybody else. But unfortunately, there's no genetic test for GAG repeats, and it doesn't seem that there's any kind of gene therapy or another medication or therapy out there that can influence how many GAG repeats your individual androgen receptors have. But what we can influence are the androgen receptor co-regulators. One of such co-regulators is cyclic adenosine monophosphate. When sex hormone binding globulin binds to its specific receptor on the cell membrane, it forms a sex hormone binding globulin receptor complex. And when androgens or estrogens bind to the SHBG receptor complex, it tells the cell to increase cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations, which then help with androgen-mediated gene transcription. But I already made a detailed video about SHBG and how to manipulate your SHBG levels. I'll link it at the end of this one. And keep in mind that berberine, caffeine, Cialis, Viagra, and Levitra are all known to increase intracellular cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations, which might have an overlapping effect into androgen-mediated gene transcription, even though I feel that the scientific evidence is a little bit lacking on this part. Still, you would do best to keep your SHBG levels under control when you take steroids, like I explained in that other video. And besides cyclic adenosine monophosphate, there are actually a lot of up-regulators, co-activators, or co-regulators that contribute to androgen-mediated gene transcription and contribute to anabolism in the presence of androgens and exercise. I also have to mention that androgen receptors have a lot of genetic polymorphisms, and the androgen receptor of the prostate, the brain, skeletal muscle, or other tissues of the body might not be exactly the same. So if there's scientific evidence that a particular compound upregulates the androgen receptor, or is a co-activator for the androgen receptor, or is an inhibitor of the androgen receptor, right, etc., 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 that might be tissue specific. Still, I reviewed all of the scientific literature, so you don't have to. Citations down below, evidence-based with citations. Yes, please, frontal bicep for that, because nobody else will. But you have to take it with a grain of salt sometimes, because the scientific evidence might have been performed in cases of prostate cancer or only within the brain or another tissue, right? It's not always the case for skeletal muscle. And of course, you want to upregulate, have beneficial effects regarding the androgen receptors in skeletal muscle, right? I mentioned specifically where the particular scientific evidence is stemming from, and do yourself a favor to read the citations down below. So here are the androgen receptor co-activators and co-regulators. High load resistance training increases androgen receptor density in skeletal muscle. So that's a plus for us, right? If you want to take some steroids, also go to the gym. Otherwise, those steroids have nothing to bind to. Vitamin D3 metabolite actually increases androgen receptor gene expression in prostate cells. So I'm not entirely sure if vitamin D3 metabolites can actually upregulate androgen receptors in skeletal muscle. L-carnitine L-tartrate increases androgen receptor content in skeletal muscle in human subjects after 21 days. But I think there's only 1 or 2 studies that actually prove it. Citations down below in case you're interested. Dihydroepiandrosterone, DHEA, increases androgen receptor expression in the brain. Not entirely sure if that translates to skeletal muscle. Androgens, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, oxandrolone, trenbolone, dianabol, and perhaps more all upregulate androgen receptor gene expression in various tissues. Could be skeletal muscle, could be the prostate, could be other tissues. But from the research which I just highlighted, there's a good amount of scientific evidence that androgens upregulate androgen receptors, and thus, by taking androgens, you get more androgen receptors and thus more potential for binding and more androgen-mediated gene transcription. So it kind of has a self-fulfilling purpose in that sense. Androgens or estrogen-bound sexual binding globulin receptor complex increases cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations within the cells. And of course, it's the CAMP, which have androgen receptor stimulation, influences gene expression, modifying the activity of the co-activators and co-repressors. We'll get into that. And there's even cyclic adenosine monophosphate and protein kinase A signaling crosstalk. Estradiol increases cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations within the cells, but it also interacts with a co-activator called androgen receptor ARA70 complex that has been studied mostly in prostate cancers. Zinc, the binding domain of the nuclear receptors, consists of 2 zinc fingers, which can recognize specific DNA sequences. So you would do well to supplement with a little bit of zinc when you take steroids. Then there's a boatload of co-activators, which I'm not entirely sure what their specific roles are. I just got this from a single study, which is cited down below. The only one that I recognize is ARA70 because it helps with estrogen-mediated co-activation. But the other ones are a little bit beyond me. And then there's also a good amount of androgen receptor inhibitors, disruptors, and co-repressors. And this list is actually quite extensive. And I would highly advise you to take notes because many of these you should avoid all entirely. So let's get started with cortisol. Suppresses androgen signaling by downregulating the expression of the androgen receptors and also suppresses endogenous testosterone production, but that's a little bit of an afterthought when you take exogenous testosterone or anabolic androgenic steroids, which also have a suppressive effect on cortisol secretion. And I think I know some of you guys are going to go wild in the comment section because I used to mention that selenium contributes to androgen-mediated gene transcription. After doing more research, I stand corrected. I apologize. Apparently, selenium suppresses androgen signaling by downregulating expression of the androgen receptor, but that's only in the context of prostate cancer. And diindolmethane has anti-androgenic effects, inhibits androgen-induced androgen receptor translocation into the nucleus, also only studied in prostate cancer. So there is no clear scientific evidence that selenium actually contributes to androgen-mediated gene transcription. So I have no idea where I got it from. So I have to apologize to my audience. I was wrong. Yeah, my sincere apologies. I might have misinterpreted a study about selenium in the context of testicular function, and we do know that selenium contributes to testicular function and overall semen production. So I might have misread something there a couple years ago. Now, keep in mind that many of the studies in which selenium is shown to have anti-androgen receptor effects is also often in combination with finasteride or dutasteride, which are known to downregulate the androgen receptor and reduce serum dihydrotestosterone levels. So I'm not entirely sure how much of an overlapping effect there is between selenium and finasteride or dutasteride. But again, it's been studied in context of prostate cancer and prostate cancer alone. And selenium is a little bit hard to avoid because it's found in all the animal meat sources. And if you like Brazil nuts, then your selenium intake is going to be sky freaking high. And again, it's good for testicular function. And if you care about your fertility, I would not abstain from selenium in any way, shape, or form. You basically have to go full vegan. And we all know where you end up when you are a full vegan. And regarding diindolmethane, again, there's no evidence that it has anti-androgen receptor effects in skeletal muscle because as far as I am able to piece together, it's not been studied in this context. So I would say if you want to inhibit the potential for prostate cancer formation, maybe selenium and diindolmethane is a good idea. And from my personal experience, having used diindolmethane and good amount of selenium at the same time, I can't say that I noticed an anti-androgenic effect regarding androgen receptor downregulation, and that my steroids, or being now drug-free, has a negative effect on my overall muscularity. So, right, take it all with a grain of salt. It's been studied in prostate cancer, but not in skeletal muscle. Okay, let's move on. There's several co-repressors, but I'm not entirely sure if we can influence those and how they work at all. There's 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, dutasteride, finasteride, red reishi mushroom extract, and saw palmetto extract, which downregulate the expression of the androgen receptor and lower androgen receptor upregulating dietary testosterone levels. There's anti-androgens, which have a negative blocking effect on the androgen receptor. Bisphenol A, BPA, which is commonly used in the production of plastics, epoxy resin, and the lining of metal cans. So you would do best to avoid that wherever possible. And these contraceptives have synthetic progestins with anti-androgenic effects, so you would do best to avoid those. Dioxins are environmental pollutants that can be produced from the combustion of certain materials, so don't go running any crazy experiments in your backyards. Apparently, flax seeds contain lignans, which might have weak anti-androgenic effects. So take chia seeds instead, which is also a superfood for omega-3 rich content. Heavy metals, cadmium and lead, can disrupt androgen signaling. Maybe do some blood work to screen for heavy metals to see if you need EDTA chelation therapy to get that cadmium and lead out of the body, so you have normal androgen signaling on the androgen receptor. Herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides, specifically ketoconazole, have anti-androgenic effects. Licorice has anti-androgenic activity in animal models, which is very bad news for all the licorice-loving Europeans out there. I sure love my licorice, and I will never give it up. Ornithines, tributylin TBT, is once used as an anti-fouling agent and has anti-androgenic effects. Peppermint tea, apparently some studies insinuate that peppermint tea might have anti-androgenic effects. Phthalates and parabens found in plastic personal care products and some medical devices. So just read the back of the label if it contains phthalates or parabens. And polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, are industrial chemicals that were once used in electrical equipment, but it seems that it's now banned in most countries. And then there's a triclosan, which is an antimicrobial agent found in some personal care products like soaps and toothpaste. So again, read the labels. So it's a larger list of things you should avoid, particularly ketoconazole, finasteride, and dutasteride, and of course spironolactone, aldactone, which is also an androgen receptor inhibitor. Right, so now knowledge is power. Make sure that you don't do anything crazy for longer periods of time regarding these particular compounds, because otherwise your anabolic potential might be severely diminished. So you would be wise to avoid all of these, but again, selenium is going to be hard to avoid unless you go full vegan, and dinomethane you can avoid, but you know, I have a lot of experience recommending dinomethane to various clients on hormone replacement therapy protocols or women, and I can't say from all the observations that I've done on men or women running dinomethane that there's any anti-androgenic effects, but it might have a favorable outcome on your libido and estrogen balance nonetheless. So, right, maybe do additional research to see if dinomethane is for you or not for you because you're scared about androgen receptor downregulation. And to be fair, I love flax seeds, especially flaxseed butter, and I love licorice and I love peppermint tea. I don't give a what the scientific evidence says. I will never take those out of my diet. And there's actually a lot more scientific evidence regarding androgen receptor upregulation and messenger RNA expression in various human and animal studies investigating if myostatin levels increase following the administration of exogenous anabolic androgenic steroids. But let's save that for a separate video, dropping soon. Subscribe now so you don't miss it, because there might be some evidence that myostatin levels go up, but there's also a good amount of scientific evidence on how to bring myostatin levels down, right? So let's see if we need to manage myostatin levels at all when we take steroids. Video dropping soon. So long story short, androgens increase androgen receptors. And if you want to enhance androgen-mediated gene transcription, just take more androgens, bro. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the more androgens you take, the more androgen receptors you get. And you can enhance this process even further by keeping your sexual binding globulin levels in the middle of the range. Try as hard as you might. It might be difficult, but I have a separate video dedicated to the cause. Keep your estradiol levels to the top of the reference range or slightly. Super physiological, again, depending on tolerance and individual response. And you would do best if you supplement with a little bit of zinc or L-carnitine, L-tartrate, or injectable carnitine, which have some beneficial effects for the androgen receptors as well. Look into caffeine, look into berberine, look into Cialis to increase cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations besides the SHBG receptor complex. And I think if you do everything along these lines, you don't need to come off. And you don't need to change compounds because the compounds will take care of themselves, right? And if you stagnate after 6 to 8 weeks on a particular drug cocktail, increase the dose. You're probably just used to the cosmetic appearances. You might have stalled out on muscularity and you might have stalled out on strength, right? And besides increasing your food intake, right? If you want to improve the androgen receptor process, take more androgens. Food for thought. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the YouTube description section, including all of the citations in case you want to do your own research. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at VigorSteve. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. An androgen-mediated frontable bicep for you guys. I'm very ready for Up-Regulation, but I'm going to have to patiently wait. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.